So we are now live and people will start joining in. And I'm going to put us over onto Facebook Live. All right, we're just setting up our Facebook Live feed right now. So give me a minute. Someone says, reminds us to smile. I was just working on our Facebook stream. All right, so we are going to get started. Thanks for your patience as we stream onto Facebook. I'm Rainey Bench. I'm the executive director for the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and I'm really excited to be here for our 34th Chebacco chat with Betsy Hewlett. And I'm just going to share our PowerPoint presentation. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the island and its history with nurserymen and gardening, which, as we've all put our gardens down for the season, is maybe a little bit bittersweet for us to think about. Thanks for joining us, Betsy. And I also want to give a special thanks to Bar Harbor Bank and Trust for their support of our Chebacco Chat series. These have been a really great opportunity for us to talk with authors and historians and share more about the island's history and culture with as broad of audience as we can reach. So Betsy, thank you. Your article, The Island Landscape Gardening Culture, The Legacy of Nurserymen from 1880 to 1920, appeared in our 2016 edition of Chebacco, which was focused on the Park Centennial and looking a little bit at the legacy of the Acadian borderlands and sort of what was happening in these in-between spaces. And Betsy, in addition to being a really dedicated volunteer for the Historical Society, she's also been a retired administrator who's worked with several of the area nonprofits, including the Land and Garden Preserve and the Maine Community Foundation. So we're really excited to have you here with us today, Betsy. And we're going to dig in by having you read an excerpt from your article. Have you picked something out that you want to share?
Sure, I'd be glad to. And thank you for having me. Let me start here, page 40. A culture of landscape gardening initiated over 100 years ago on Mount Desert Island is today a history rich with family stories, interwoven cultivated gardens and naturally occurring wooded vistas, social and economic transitions, and lush public gardens. Mount Desert Island garden history is uniquely present and as relevant today as in the past. Summer estate gardens continue to bedazzle, some shared with the public through garden club sponsored tours. Public spaces in all 4 island towns are enriched with gardens and special niches of carefully planned landscapes and conserved natural vistas and open spaces. Maine Coast Heritage Trust, founded on the island in 1970 and now a statewide organization, builds on the precedent of these over 100 years of island beautification through its stewardship of a network of public land conservation easements and often heroic land preservation efforts. I just want to mention a couple of other sentences here too. Small sea and farming villages and their lifestyles transformed to a trades-based economy fueled by off-island resources flowing in through summer residence with elaborate wants and needs, one of which was beautiful gardens.
That's great. And I love, and one of the things that really stuck out to me in your article is this sort of idea of these wild landscapes and cultivated landscapes really right up against one another in the park and with Acadia National Park, and then also with some of the estates. And in your article, you have a statement from George Dorr, who recognized, as you say, quote, the delicate and dynamic relationship of native plant vistas adjacent to carefully cultivated landscapes. So this was really striking to me because I was always thinking of George Dorr and his preservation of wild landscapes here in Acadia National Park. But reading your article introduced this whole other side to me of his passion and interest for cultivated landscapes and outdoor spaces. So can you talk a little bit about his role in how he brought that passion to Mount Desert Island and his time here?
Sure. Dorr it was always known to me as the founder of Acadia National Park. And unlike Teddy Roosevelt and some of the people that were in the western part of our country only looking at wildlands, Dorr had a very different perspective that he was bringing to his work at Acadia National Park. And it stemmed from his education. He was a graduate of Harvard. He lived on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, and his family routinely went to Europe. He spent the better part of 5 years after he graduated from Harvard in Europe. And he was not employed at the time. He was traveling with his family. He was going from estate to estate. He was hiking with his brother in the Alps. He was spending time for 2 months, it says, in one of Ron Epps' wonderful excerpts, it says that he spent 2 months in northern England living on a beautiful estate with incredible gardens. And of course, that's very close to the Scottish border. And he undoubtedly went to Scotland at the time and saw many of the gardens that were there. So he studied European and Eurocentric ways of looking at landscapes. He comes back to Mount Desert Island fascinated with science, the hybridization of plants. He was an active member of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, which was founded in 1829 for the purpose of being a forum for bringing plants into the US from other parts of the world. So he saw himself not just as a preserver and a conserver, but he also saw himself as a scientist, and he wanted to take advantage of that here on Mount Desert Island. And that's why he started the Mount Desert Nurseries in 1893. And it's interesting, the slide you have here is the view from his home, Old Farm, which we all know on Compass Harbor. And just to the right of this view is what was referred to as his mother's pleasure garden. And Mary Dorr was known across the island to have the most beautiful pleasure garden here. And she was famous for her exotics and the plants that she had in her garden. So it isn't that Dorr was just hiking the mountains and on the trails. He was a very learned man and very interested in science. And he loved the fact that he was a horticulturalist at heart.
So I found really interesting, again, we're in this borderlands. So talking about a general love of plants and nature and all these different wild spaces that Dorr went and spent time with, in addition to the cultivated spaces, but moving and transplanting plants from one ecosystem to another, one country to another, we know now has really significant consequences to it. So were there new species that were coming on to the island that ended up being invasive or ended up causing problems and challenges kind of inadvertently as a result of bringing all these species from all over the world to MDI?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm really not steeped in horticulture to the point where I can answer it directly. But I guess I could say maybe, probably, yes. Um, and one of my interests in this topic initially was the European fire ant that a lot of us have in our soils and in our gardens and in other places here on the island. They've shown up in the playgrounds at the schools. Um, and where did that ant come from? It is not a native species here. And we're talking about an insect, not a plant. But that ant probably started in plants that were brought from Europe into the Mount Desert Nursery in the early 1900s. So I can't trace it directly, maybe, but we can trace it through people. We can trace it through people and gardens and who was handling those materials and how they moved around the island. Now, as far as plants, some of the plants that you will see advertised in the Mount Desert Nursery catalogs are considered invasive today. One would be barberry, which has recently been put on the invasive list here. And Rainey, you asked me once about bittersweet. And there is a bittersweet climber that's listed in many of the catalogs. I think it's the American bittersweet, though, which is not necessarily an invasive, but I'm not sure of that. And so I think the next, if someone gets excited about the topic, that an analysis of the Mount Desert Nursery catalogs from 1893 through 1920 would be very interesting to see how many invasives they were bringing. They brought a lot of plants in when they initially started the nurseries. George Dorr immediately turned over the management of Mount Desert Nurseries to William Miller. William Miller was a Scot. He knew the markets. He was a nurseryman in Scotland before he came here to the States. He knew where to get plants. And because Dorr wanted the nursery to start immediately, he had to bring in plants. He was not at the luxury of hybridizing and growing things here first. So probably for the first 10 years of Mount Desert Nurseries, they were continuing to import plants from Europe. Those plants probably were coming in with diseases. They probably were coming in with insects, and many of the plants themselves have probably proven to be invasive in the long run.
Now, you mentioned that probably you could be, somebody's research could really go back in and dig through these catalogs and look and see what was coming and being offered and what's been determined later to be invasive. Where are the catalogs now that you were able to work with?
Well, I would imagine that maybe even some of the viewers have some in their homes. But the catalogs that I worked with were online. Also, you can, I think the New York Botanical Garden, you showed in the initial slide, there was a picture of the catalog of the phloxes and the irises, I believe, and the peonies.
Yeah,
that came from the New York Botanical Garden website. The Land and Garden Preserve in their archives here on the island have 3 of the catalogs from various years. Patrick Chesset has been collecting the catalogs as well, and his archives have recently, I believe, been transferred to the Maine Historical Society, and they'll probably be available through there. I would love to see someone do the research on it.
Yeah, that would be a great future edition of Chebacco if anyone's interested. So this island, the Mount Desert Island Nursery, is really quite a huge establishment that is sort of adjacent to Compass Harbor. You can go and see some of the spaces there now. You talk about the number of people that are employed there, both seasonally and year round. So were these island residents? Were these people coming in to work? You mentioned Miller came specifically in to help launch this industry, but what happened to the demographics of the island as a result?
Well, most of the people who were employed at Mount Desert Nurseries were immigrants. They were not people from the island. And I think there's a chart in.
Yes, I'm having a hard time with the PowerPoint.
That's okay.
I'm going to the next slide.
Most of the people involved in the nurseries were immigrants and people new to the island. They were not families who were redirecting their resources to working in the trades. There was some of that, but the majority of it was immigrant labor, coming mostly young white men from Scotland, Ireland, many of them coming through New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, coming down through that portal. Um, uh, yeah, I don't know how well we can all see this, but basically the chart is laid out so that red is 1880, blue is 1920. And on the horizontal axis, you see the first occupations: farmer, laborer, shipping seaman, fisherman, boatman. Those are on the left. Those were the four major occupations shown in the census of 1880. Then as you work your way down through, the occupations were less and less and less in 1880. And I don't want to really get into an analysis of the whole chart. What you would see if the population was holding stable and occupations were holding stable, you would basically see a doubling of each of those professions. But we don't see that at all during this 40-year period. What we're seeing is that there's a new profession that you see on the far right called gardening. Doesn't even appear in 1880. Actually, I think there was one person that reported in the 1880s. There's a little red dot there somewhere. But what we see is 160 occupations, people reporting an occupation of gardener in 1920, when there were none reporting that same occupation in 1880. So this is a big shift. And this is also the period of time when immigrants were coming to Bar Harbor, Mount Desert. And it was a huge growth point in the history of our island as far as people. So those people are coming in, they're willing to take trades that no one else here really either knows or wants. And this is the shift that we see.
And so this shift is really, you've mentioned there's sort of other ethnicities coming in, groups from other places. And so it represents different kinds of cultural shifts that would be taking place on the island as well. And one of the things that you point out in the article that I thought was interesting is that the vast majority of these positions are held by men. There were very few positions, not just in gardening, but among any of the professions that you traced. Women here were generally in more traditional sort of women's sphere, in the homemakers, doing those domestic chores, whereas the men were out working for paid professional. And even with this influx, that doesn't change.
Right. And this is very different than what was going on in urban New England. Because if you look at these same types of census figures during this same period of time for Boston, for other urban areas in New England, you're seeing a lot of women in the profession pool. You're seeing women occupations in factories, and you don't see that here. And an interesting example is William Miller, who I've mentioned earlier, who was an employee of Dorr until 1912 and brought to the island by Dorr. His wife, the family had 6 children, and his wife served as the cook and cleaner and whatever for a boarding house that was in their home, or they took over another house, maybe 2 or 3 doors down, and she ran the boarding house that brought in people as seasonal workers from Ireland or Scotland, or were friends of families or whatever. So it wasn't as though women were totally unemployed or just eating bonbons somewhere out in the park. They were definitely working very hard. They were working behind the scenes and in traditional home-based occupations, I guess you should say.
And this chart represented another really fascinating shift that your article talks a little bit about, and that is land ownership. So what happens with land ownership in this time?
Yeah, I really don't focus on that a lot in the article, but the land ownership, this is the period of time when native islanders were not holding on to their land. They were selling land. And this is the time when Dorr and his and the other summer residents were collecting the pool of land that later became the park. So during this period of time when occupations were changing, estates were being built, there's also a major shift in land. ownership on the island. And there's no occupation here that refers to selling of land.
Mm.
And I point out in the article that by 1920, there were 2 people reporting occupations in Bar Harbor and Mount Desert that were related to selling of land. But it's interesting, and again, another study that somebody needs to do, which is an analysis of deed transfers during this period of time. And I think it would be very telling as to why some of these people were no longer farming
Mm.
uh, because their land was no longer theirs.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's an interesting shift for sure. So to be working in, sorry, my PowerPoint is not advancing, so I have to keep backing out of it to switch screens. But so as we talked a little bit about the different people coming in and doing the work and what was involved in being a nurseryman and working in these nurseries, it was a different kind of relationship that was being formed between the employer and the staff. So it was not what we see in some of the other either service or tourist-based industries that we find on the island. So can you talk a little bit about what you found with that?
Yeah. First of all, when you have a garden, as we all know, it doesn't start in July and end in August. It's a year-round endeavor. And so that quickly established a year-round position for gardeners here on the island. So no longer, the gardeners weren't coming with the summer people when they brought up their luggage and their staff and their carriages and their horses. When the gardeners were already here on the island, and they had already prepped the estate gardens, and they had already taken care of the stonescapes and all of the work that needed to happen so that that beautiful garden was fully in bloom, in place, and could be enjoyed by the family. So their stature as members of that family on a year-round basis was established partially because of their role. And many of the household staff who worked in the estates came with the summer residents when they moved here. Their cooks, their butler, the maids, the laundress, they moved with the family, whereas the gardening staff maintained homes here on the island year round. And oftentimes that was a very valued position. And they were considered members of the family in some ways. In many of the estates, there were homes built for the caretaker, which the role later became. There were houses rented in town. An example in Seal Harbor, there were 2 homes rented by the Rockefeller family so that the caretakers and the garden staff could have year-round housing. So this was started early, where garden staff had a certain stature and a certain familial role in the estates.
Yeah, your article has these great exchanges between Miller and the Rockefellers that really point to that personal relationship that they're communicating, definitely as staff and employer, but also in some ways in respected peers, where there's a degree of deference to the gardener who is much more knowledgeable and much more, an authority on what's happening in those outdoor spaces. And I'm certain you wouldn't have seen that sort of deferential treatment and attitude in a lot of the other relationships between staff and the households.
Well, and also I think that the gardens and on the estates and a lot of the beautiful landscaping that was done was really a prestige element for the people that came here in the summer. Having a beautiful garden and having it maintained beautifully and inviting your friends to come see it, it was part of your face. You wanted people to know this about you. And the prettier the garden, the more it was maintained and taken care of, the better you looked.
Well, and that brings up another kind of our last point. These chats always go really fast, and I would encourage people as we have our last question from me, that any questions you have, there's a couple that have popped up in the Zoom meeting, but if you're on Facebook, I would encourage you to post your questions or comments as we finish up here. But talking about those, that investment in the physical landscape around the house and the prestige that it was associated with, it meant that you couldn't just sort of walk into a garden as a gardener and just get started. There was a really high level of previous knowledge and skill that one had to have to take over these outdoor landscaping environments. And so I had the impression from your article that it allowed an apprentice relationship to form with the master gardeners that you didn't see necessarily, again, in other sort of year-round or household service positions that we would find among islanders.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think the Millers are a good example here. When William Miller stopped working for the Rockefeller family, his son took his job. And this was not an unusual thing to happen during the period of time that I'm writing here. And that's partially because in a lot of cases, the gardener's family lived on the estate. So it was very natural that the children in the family came up steeped in what that gardening meant to the owner and to the estate owner.
Nice. We've got a few questions coming in. Is there really any data on gardeners on MDI today? Great talk, thank you. But yeah, just I'm curious about any data on gardeners for the island today.
In terms of occupations, I don't know the percentages now, but I do know somebody who recently moved here thought that they were going to be living next door to fishermen and lobstermen, and everybody's a gardener. So yeah, the landscaping trades here are very popular on the island, and it is a good way for a family to make a living by having a gardening related business. And I think it's also, there's a lot of respect on the island for people who work in the landscaping and gardening trades. That is not always the case in a small community or in a large community. And I think here there's a real valuing of people who are creative with our land.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it was a surprise that I encountered when I moved here as well. You know, I've lived in lots and lots of different places in the country, and I'd never seen so many gardeners. And my dad was a plant pathologist. I mean, I grew up around, but they were agricultural crops, but still. Yeah, that was interesting. We have another question. Did you find any evidence of the influence of nurseryman Andrew Jackson Downing on MDI landscaping? Dora's memoirs contain a tribute essay to Downing's unsurpassed influence on American horticulture, but any on here on MDI?
That's not a familiar name to me. That's not a familiar name, but if Dora respected him, he probably was here. I just did not run into it.
Yeah. So I would just also mention that if anyone watching hasn't had a chance to go out to Compass Harbor and take a look at what is still evident there after Betsy and I met to talk about this article together and doing this Chebacco chat, I took my son and my dog out for a walk around that area and was really surprised at how little evidence there is, both at the House of Old Farm of what gardens would have been there, but also of this 30-acre nursery establishment that was there for decades. The fact that you just really don't see very much evidence, apart from, you mentioned a couple houses that were there and some ponds.
Ponds, right. And another thing that was adjacent to Mount Desert Nurseries was the Door Quarry. And that was another critical part of Mount Desert Nurseries business, was quarrying and using that stone in the stonescapes, that because the nursery not only had plants and greenhouses and fields of perennials and annuals, but they also had labor. And there was an article in the 1904 newspaper in Bangor that said there were 100 quarry workers hired year-round by George Dorr in his personal quarry.
Wow.
So that says it was a big industry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So really fascinating place to go out and walk around and look for clues on the landscape, this sort of idea that history happened and it can leave a mark on our landscape. And certainly you can see the evidence of nature trying to erase the mark that those nurseries left near Old Farm. So
things grow.
Yeah, they do.
Whether you want to or not, they grow.
Yeah. Any last questions? We've had a couple come in, but these conversations always go incredibly fast, and it's a pleasure, especially thinking about when we can get our fingers back in the soil again and start to garden, and to think about the impact of these nurseries on both our wild landscapes, but also our understanding of our cultivated landscapes and the tradition of gardening here on the island. I really appreciate your time and perspective and revisiting this 2016 article. I know it was a little bit, had to dust it off a little bit, but thank you for doing that because it's been a lot of
Thank
fun.
you.
So once again, I just wanted to thank Bar Harbor Bank and Trust for their sponsorship for our Chebacco Chat series. Next week, we will have Tim Garrity back for one of his last Chebacco Chats, and he's going to be sharing the work that he did on our Centennials exhibition that was in Soamesville this summer. A lot of people didn't have a chance to see it because of the nature of the pandemic, but it was a really great exhibit comparing and contrasting how we understand and celebrate milestones like statehood. So hopefully you'll have a chance to tune in next week. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll see you on next week's Chebacco Chat.